really because of really inefficient regulatory mechanisms that the FDA employs, GRAS has now become this freebie for manufacturers. Now they can self-certify just about any substance as GRAS, and they don't even need to go and tell the FDA. They could just give themselves some comfort by saying, we're just going to say this is GRAS. And the FDA doesn't even have the complete universe of what chemicals are out there in food. And so that is another way manufacturers of food contact materials can circumvent effective review. So where does that leave us? Not in a great place. I do a little bit of comparative work between the United States and the European Union. And in the European Union, currently, there are uses of PFAS that are still not banned, but PFAS in food contact material has been banned effectively since 2020. As of very recently, BPA is now also officially banned. And so, in effect, in the European Union, manufacturers are either no longer using these substances or at least are working towards finding less chemically intensive alternatives that don't include either PFAS and BPA. What that tells us is that's possible. It is possible to make French fry bags that somehow contain the grease without having to use tons and tons of PFAS in there to make them grease proof, because there's an entire continent that functions without these chemicals just well. But in the United States, none of these chemicals are formally regulated. BPA is not regulated, BPS is not regulated, phthalates are not regulated. Somewhat recently, a couple of years ago, the FDA moved on some of these, most notably phthalates in cosmetics, but has not done anything with respect to food and food contact materials. Last spring, the FDA came out with a very sensational announcement that said no more PFAS in paper in the United States. And so everybody was up in arms. Oh my gosh, the FDA actually moved and did something about it, until you drill down into it. And what it really was just an announcement that some manufacturers had voluntarily chosen to produce PFAS-free paper that doesn't go to the cups, the pizza boxes, a lot of those paper containers. It in no way goes to the plastic containers that constantly get fluorinated and pick up a huge amount of PFAS and transfer it to food. That really just goes to like the paper, like the wrapping paper and certain paper products that are sold in stores. But again, that's voluntary, which means that industry can at any one point reverse course and reintroduce those products on the market, and there is absolutely no regulatory mechanism to stop them. And as I said, BPA-free and PFAS-free and phthalate-free alternatives are available, and we know that. So it is not an economic hardship, or at least not a significant one, for companies to switch to those alternatives. It is just a matter of regulatory inertia and the regulator not really engaging with those issues. Where do we go from here? It's a little hard to predict because the FDA and HHS in general have been subjects to heated discussion over the last month and a half. There's quite a bit of unresolved tension between a lot of the different policy objectives. On the one hand, we have mass production and enforce and a general deregulatory agenda of the current administration. On the other hand, the Make America Healthy Again movement has been very sensitive to the issues of chemicals in food. They've focused a lot more on the expressly added chemicals, things like food additives, color additives, and preservatives, but they are, at least tangentially, bumping into this issue of food contact materials and the chemicals and toxins that leach out and transfer from those materials onto food. And so it really is kind of anybody's guess as to where this tension leads and how it gets resolved. But a lot of those issues really require robust legislative overhaul, which is not very likely to happen anytime soon. And even the changes that can happen on the regulator level, they require a lot of people. They require a lot of field inspectors and a lot of scientists looking into all of these issues. And currently that's not particularly likely. So one of the things we can continue to count on is voluntary actions by industry. And we're seeing that again in some of those other areas where sweeteners and sodium and food additives are being attacked or handled currently by increased interaction with industry and relying on their voluntary actions. One of the big problems or pitfalls for voluntary actions, it comes from imports, because no matter what US-based manufacturers agree to abide by, even if it's a pinky promise, let's say they keep it, there's absolutely no authority to regulate what happens abroad. There are many countries that have even laxer regulation, not the EU, obviously, but there are many countries that import heavily into the United States single-use containers, and those containers continue to have staggering amounts of PFAS, not just the new PFAS, but even the PFAS we had effectively banned that we thought were off the market. We still find them in tests over and over and over again in imported products. And so no matter what voluntary actions US-based industry takes, imports are always going to continue being a problem. Another possible path forward is through private certifications. We're seeing that happen more and more, where various third-party certifiers are starting to issue certifications such as PFAS-free that give consumers some level of comfort. The problem there, the pitfall there, is abuse and greenwashing. We have seen it before and with many different types of certifications, right? There are certain certifications such as USDA certified organic. When they're handled by a regulator, at least they're reliable, but then there is all sorts of labels that can biodegradable, compostable, green, natural, safe, healthy. All of those labels can be misused, and the same is true for PFAS-free, for example. A lot of companies back in the day, when the main offender in the PFAS legacy family, called PFOS with an O, when that one stopped being produced on the market, lots of people just put PFAS-free on their labels, even though they were far from PFAS-free. They had probably another 25 chemicals in there, but they just felt like that gives them just enough plausibility and cover. And so that can be a problem. And then the third option, the third path forward, is trying to move society culturally away from single-use containers as much as possible. I will say, not to leave on a downer note, but I will say that reusable containers can have their own host of problems, most notably heavy metals. So there's a safer and a less safe class in reusable containers. So glass can have heavy metals, most particularly lead, and then glazed mugs or other ceramic can be problematic. Funnily enough, the FDA is not doing a great job on heavy metals or lead, but it's actually doing about as good of a job as they have done on any chemical. And so those are still way more monitored and way more regulated and way safer. And so a general cultural shift towards reusable containers, I think, is probably a much more realistic hope than it would be to wait for the regulators to do anything about this issue. That's all I have for you, but I'm more than happy to answer any questions now, or you can see my contact information.
Thank you, Katya.
If I can stop.
And do we have, please just shout out right now, since I don't have you on gallery view, if you have any questions for Katya. Well, I have one question.
I have one.
Okay, Sharon, why don't you go?
Okay. Hi, Katya. I'm curious what you would say the role of public health in this country is. I wonder why public health hasn't been messaging to people about the fact that these containers are creating, contribute to disease. So let's think about the smoking campaign. Many fewer people smoke now, and there was a lot of messaging to happen. Why are they silent? Why is public health silent?
Primarily because, and that's one of the main differences between the European Union and the United States, is the European Union functions on what we call the precautionary principle. So they start from the assumption that something is unsafe, and then they only move towards adopting it if it has been affirmatively proven to be safe. We, being the entrepreneurial industrial nation that we are, think, well, I don't want to wait 10 or 15 years to figure out if this is safe. A lot of our regulatory system and legislative system work on, let's try it. And if it can prove that it's not safe, only then we're going to stop using it. But if you think about it, and actually the smoking campaign is a great example because we look at it from this end of the smoking campaign. But if you look at the decades and decades that the tobacco manufacturers use the same playbook, which is to say, here's 20 studies that says this causes lung cancer. Here's one study that injects just enough uncertainty to make you feel like maybe that's not proven sufficiently. And right now, a lot of the industry, the chemical industry follows the same playbook, right? So we have all of these like 10 or 15 studies that says that X PFAS chemical is problematic. Then they would pay for a study or two that says, well, it's actually negligible. And if you think about the regular exposure times, it's not that bad. I was coming across many different studies. Again, the overwhelming majority of them would say things like when you microwave popcorn, you end up with like 3,000 parts per trillion in one batch of popcorn. That's really, really problematic. But then they would try a different measurement test, a different assay to conduct the test. And some of the studies would be like, no, it's not that bad. Here's why it's not a problem. And so it takes 10 or 15 years to establish it. And just as soon as you establish it and the scientists in charge of this start feeling some level of comfort that they can say, okay, the bulk of scientific evidence agrees, industry comes up with a new chemical and they say, this is a brand new one. You have absolutely no evidence to prove that this is a problem. And the whole thing restarts again. This messaging hasn't even reached public health authorities because the scientists have not yet gotten to this level where they would say definitively a problem. As I said a few years ago, 2-3 years ago, when EPA passed those maximum containment levels, that was the closest we got to like a scientific consensus. And even that, it would have been laughable if it wasn't so sad to watch it happen over 6 or 7 years, because initially EPA and FDA were like, not a problem at all, completely safe, completely inert, they don't do anything. 2 years later, EPA goes, oh, it's a problem, but it's safe up to 300 parts per trillion. 2 years later, they were like, oh, it is a problem and it's only safe up until 10 parts per trillion. And then 2 years ago, they came and said, actually, it's 0. It turns out there's absolutely no safe levels. FDA was still saying 500 parts per trillion. There was just no communication even at the scientific level, let alone for it to actually reach the mainstream. Mainstream doctors are still not agreeing on sugar and fats, right? Like they're still now having a consistent public health message, even on things that science has already been more clear, let alone on this. This is still pretty edgy for them.
That was a very depressing answer, but
I'm sorry.
but you used in your talk the term, I wrote it down, reasonable certainty. That doesn't work for public health, reasonable certainty?
It does. It's just really hard to overcome the inertia when something has been put into the manufacturing process. It's really hard to get to reasonable certainty. We keep saying, what is reasonable certainty? Is it really that certain? If we can't agree on exposure levels and we can't agree on what is a health dose and we can't find these chronic exposures, they're a lot harder to attribute health causes to because they happen over 20 years and you're ingesting little by little by little every meal. And so 20 years later, when someone has cancer, it's really hard to be like, oh, it must have been from the French fries, right? Like it's really hard to connect. They, over 16 or 17 states over the past few years have passed laws that say that PFAS cannot be used in firefighting foam, because eventually they determined that that is such a huge cause of exposure for firefighters. They were en masse getting really sick from it. But that took a decade to establish just that causality, even though they had a very contained sample of people who had really high levels of exposure. Even that was like, well, who knows? Maybe he smoked. Maybe he got sick from some other cause. And so it's just really difficult to get to that reasonable certainty level.
Thank you.
Go ahead. I don't, your name is being blocked now. But go ahead.
I had my, can I go? I had my hand up. Katya, I have a question. Well, I have 2 questions. One is about testing, is there any, what are the, if we wanted to test a food packaging product, I work with a lot of community composters who are composting at schools or community gardens or urban farms, not these big necessarily industrial sites. And I'm trying to tell them, leave out all the paper. When in doubt, leave it out. But it's a little hard. We even have a commercial county-run facility that's encouraging people to put their ice cream containers in the compost bin, which I don't understand. But I'm just wondering, like, is there any citizen science or low-cost ways to test for PFAS in food contact packaging? Or do you have to send out to labs for $1,000? And just what would be your advice for composters based on what you've learned?
Yeah, it's really, there's no cheap way. Everything having to do with PFAS right now is really expensive. There are labs around the country. Most labs are equipped to only test about 16 different chemicals. Some high-tech labs would test up to 30. There are very, very few labs in the country that could actually test for a broader range. Some labs have started testing for free fluorine, which seems to be not a perfect but decent indicator that some PFAS is in there without being able to actually pinpoint which one it is. Solid matter is harder to test than liquid. So testing water is still expensive actually, but it's not as controversial because the methods that labs use are now pretty well established. Whereas the way you would create, and again, this is me not being a scientist and being a lawyer, but my understanding is that the way you would create the test samples from solid matter involves different kinds of solutions. And so depending on the acidity of the solution, the concentration of the solution, that's where a lot of that difficulty with coming up with a similar result has arisen over the years. And so, yeah, there's no easy or citizen-friendly way to do it. Certifications are one way. So, there's paper products that are certified by OMRI, for example, if they're going to be used in the agricultural space, or compost mixes that are certified being PFAS free. And those organizations are fairly reputable. So I go for that when I'm doing my gardening. It's really hard to come up with brown matter for composting when you exclude paper, but I try not to. Like anything that I've commercially bought, I would not compost it, no matter what it says. If it says compostable, if it says biodegradable, I don't go for it. If I buy a roll of butcher paper that says PFAS free and is certified, that's not sure it's 100% safe, but it's probably the only thing I'd use for composting. But yeah, that has been one of the problems with organic farming, because organic farming doesn't use sludge fertilizers, doesn't use pesticides, and so they generally stay away from PFAS intensive applications. But organic compost has ended up being really high in PFAS. And so some tests of like organic kale ended up coming even higher than conventional kale because of the compost that they've used.
Oh my gosh. What about parchment paper? Is that, you don't know?
I don't know what that
We have
looks
a
like.
few other questions, Kate and then Tracy. Kate, you're muted.
Well, I did want to hear about the compost paper too, but I'd always heard it was safe, and then I recently heard, no, don't use it for compost. I don't know. You don't know either, you said?
About paper?
About parchment paper.
Yeah, I haven't looked into that at all, so I'm not really sure what the chemical composition of that would be.
Okay. And the question I wanted to ask, I can't formulate it exactly, but I struggle with how to talk about the problem with PFAS and the problem with microplastics, and people get confused. Like, do you have a good way of dealing with that and clarifying it for people, like what they should be worried about, what they can control?
Yeah, it's really hard to not be alarmist about this. I drive my own kids crazy when I'm like, not this and not this and not this. It's really hard to make consumer decisions on that basis. I mean, microplastics are obviously a significant environmental problem in different ways, and they're present everywhere. They've been shown, like visually see in my head right now the picture of lettuce with this microplastics lodged into its cellular structure. But I feel like PFAS is more widespread and less known. And because of the many, many different effects that it can have on human health, I consider it a health-wise a bigger problem, not necessarily environmentally. I don't have a good view of the data on what is more problematic, but I will say seafood is problematic from both microplastics and PFAS perspective. Even the FDA, in its heyday of denying that PFAS is a problem in food, would tell you to stay away from clams and stay away from all sorts of seafood that, through our polluted marine environment, has really, really high, like staggeringly high levels of PFAS. So that tends to be a safer thing to avoid nowadays for all sorts of reasons. But yeah, in general, in the agricultural area, I think of PFAS as a more pronounced problem because it's in so many different agricultural things.
Thank you.
Tracy?
Thank
Tracy?
Yeah, I'm unmuted. Sorry about that. Thank you. This has been a good presentation for, to bring these issues to more widespread awareness. I'm quite involved in PFAS, and I just wanted to call Brenda's attention to something I posted, which I use a lot. The Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners Association, a scientist on staff tested compost. They collect food waste at their very large or agricultural fair, which has more people than the state fair, and they sorted out the food wrappers. And they only have approved vendors, and they were supposed to use PFAS free, packaging or whatever, plates and stuff like that. However, they composted the food packaging with, I think, with wood chips or something, or no, with dairy manure that was PFAS, had like non-detectable PFAS, and then they composted the food with wood chips. The food waste compost had very low PFAS. The packaging had high PFAS. They had a letter published in a journal, and a layperson's article in their newspaper. And I have used that a lot of times. The county that we have our zero waste group in is going to start building a food waste composting facility, and they have agreed not to allow packaging based on this kind of information. So, and you might want to contact them, Brenda. They might give you some information on testing. But it's the same test for compost that's used for sewage sludge, and it costs like hundreds of dollars to do the test. So it's not something that you're going to do for all your compost. You're going to try to keep things out. Cardboard. The other thing I wanted to say is cardboard and many paper products have PFAS, not because it was intentionally added, sometimes from recycling, but also from the pulping process. One of the leading PFAS scientists, Graham Peasley I forget, he's at Notre Dame University, and he's a chemist and a nuclear physicist, and he's come up with these testing methods, and he was called to consult at a Scandinavian paper mill, and they wanted to know why there was PFAS in their paper, and he discovered that they were using several pounds of PFAS as a lubricant in their pulping equipment. Contaminated the river and the paper and the paper sludge. Paper sludge is a really nasty material. And in my county, there was a paper sludge composting facility that contaminated wells and soil, and it's horrible. So often these things are not intentionally added. They're manufacturing aids.
Yeah, that's part of being that there's so many chemicals and being that they're used so widely across the manufacturing processes of everything. It is really hard to. Maine is a generally fantastic resource because they've had to grapple with the issue of PFAS in agriculture really head on after they realized that a lot of their dairy farms were affected. And so they've been a pioneer, if you will, in this space. So they are generally, as a state, a really good resource for all sorts of information. But that experience with paper is very consistent with what happened in the EU back in 2020 when they said no intentionally added PFAS. Labs would test for about 16 of them. They would all come back at 0 or non-detect. And yet when they tested for free fluorine, a lot of the paper products still came back really high, and they had no idea what is causing it or what type of PFAS chemicals those were, but there were still a really high one. So yeah, paper is
Right.
really tricky.
One can test for total organic fluorine.
Yeah.
And one resource, I mean, it's about sewage sludge, but it's interesting. It will give you some idea about testing. It's a publication, a report by Sierra Club and the Ann Arbor Ecology Center called Sludge in the Garden. And you can easily find it online, maybe even the webinar that went with it.
Great. And sorry, I see there's a lot of messages in the chat, and I am
Yeah,
entirely behind on those. But if there's a question in there, let me know.
I have a quick question. Actually, a conversation I had with Sharon a few weeks ago. The metal bottles, since I've thrown out all my plastic water bottles, are they coated with anything, or are they safe to use?
And sometimes I have written to companies because some of the stainless steel bottles would have the non-fingerprint coating on them, and that to me immediately sounded like stain resistant, which always makes me think of PFAS. A few of the water bottle companies provided information that at least made it seem like it wasn't PFAS, and one of them was a Clean Canteen provided me actual third-party testing on the coating that said it was PFAS free, but that does not mean that everyone is. So it is entirely possible that some of them are coated with that. I mean, PFAS was like, if you think of Teflon and like the non-stick coating, that was the legacy one, the PFAS. And so there's definitely a history of using coating on metal that can also be problematic, but I think the polished stainless steel is safer, and that does not to say that it's completely free of everything.
Are there any other questions? If so, just raise your hand. Otherwise, we're going to go into a slightly abbreviated social breakout session. And we have a prompt that was suggested by Yayoi, and she said, and she could tell you about her recent hack, her reduces zero waste hack. Yayoi, you want to tell us before we go into our breakout room? You're muted.
Yes. Thank you so very much, Katya. It was super interesting, and I have a couple more questions, but in the interest of time, I move forward. So the social time is we're gonna just we hope that we can talk about. I hope everybody brought something that you can discuss. Like I have been in zero waste in a pretty long time, but there's always something new that I discover that I can do in everyday life. So I hope like and in Japanese language, like we say it's my boom. Like my boom, we use it like an adjective. It's like it's just your personal boom. You know, nobody knows about it. It's not like booming in society, but this hack is my personally, it's booming in my life. Yeah, kind of way, if you know what I'm talking about. If it's not clear, ask me. But anyway, so I thought that like everybody has something, and then like we can talk about it. And Anne-Marie just discussed about you know how horrible Coca-Cola is. You know, and you know, she had this like fantastic um, information on her website about how to make homemade soda, you know, something like that. My personal boom, zero waste boom, is a metal tea infuser that you can put it over the cup, and you can, you know, do away from all the microplastics in the tea bags and switch to loose leaf tea at home, and it's so easy. But I have other things too. So I thought like, you know, everybody has something. So without further ado, let's ask Amy to, you know, take us into a different room, and she might be able to do the magic of setting up some people to, you know, together if you filled out the form. So please go ahead, Amy. and put us into breakouts. And I hope you can stay.